In 1860, a plantation in Mississippi fed 114 enslaved people on a weekly ration of cornmeal and salt pork. That was it. 2 ingredients to fuel back-breaking labor from sunup to sundown. Plantation owners spent less feeding a human being for a month than they spent feeding a single horse for a week. Number 18 on this list was so revolting that even overseers refused to eat it. And number 7 was not considered food at all until enslaved people turned it into something that would reshape American cooking forever. These 25 foods were chosen deliberately, not to nourish, but to control, to keep bodies working at the lowest possible cost. Before we begin, subscribe, because the story behind American food is darker than anything you learned in school. Let us count them down. Number 25. Corn pone. The most basic bread in the American South was not bread at all. It was cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt, shaped into flat cakes and baked on the blade of a hoe held over open coals. No eggs, no milk, no leavening. Enslaved people received their weekly cornmeal ration, usually a peck per adult, roughly 8 quarts, and had to make it last 7 days. Corn pone was the answer. The dough was dense, gritty, and stuck to the teeth. But it was calories. Women would mix the meal after returning from the fields in the dark, shaping the cakes by feel because candles were not wasted on slave quarters. Children ate corn pone for breakfast, dinner, and supper. The same flat cake, the same gritty texture, the same hollow feeling an hour later, because cornmeal alone cannot sustain a working body. Plantation records from South Carolina in 1850 show that some owners calculated feed costs per enslaved person the same way they calculated feed costs for livestock. Corn pone was cheap. A bushel of corn cost about 50 cents. That was the math that mattered. Number 24, salt pork. The other half of the standard ration was salt pork, and it was not the bacon you are picturing. This was the cheapest, fattiest belly cut, cured in so much salt that it had to be soaked overnight before cooking, or it would blister the mouth. Enslaved people received between 3 and 4 pounds per week, a slab of white fat with barely a streak of lean. The salt preserved it for months in barrels, ideal for plantation owners buying in bulk from meat packers in Cincinnati. The fat provided energy, but the salt caused swelling in the hands and feet, a condition documented by plantation physicians who blamed the enslaved workers instead of recognizing the diet forced upon them. Women sliced the pork thin and fried it in its own grease, then used that grease to flavor the cornmeal. Nothing was wasted because nothing else was coming. Number 23, ash cake. When there was no skillet, no hoe blade, and no time, cornmeal was wrapped in damp cabbage leaves and buried directly in the hot ashes of the fire. The result was ash cake, a crude ball of cooked meal coated in a thin layer of grit and char. You bit into it and felt the crunch of ash between your teeth. Former enslaved people described the taste as smoky and bitter, with a chalky residue that coated the tongue. Ash cake was the food of field hands who had no cookware, of children left behind in the quarters while mothers worked, of punishment rations when even the meager standard allotment was cut. Frederick Douglass described eating ash cake as a child on the eastern shore of Maryland, scooping boiled cornmeal mush from a trough set on the ground, competing with other children for handfuls. The degradation was deliberate. Feeding people from troughs and ashes was designed to strip humanity. Yet the ash cake endured because it had to. It was survival baked in cinders. Number 22, fatback. Fatback was exactly what it sounds like. It was a thick slab of pure fat cut from the back of the hog, with no meat whatsoever. It arrived in the weekly ration as a substitute for salt pork when the plantation owner wanted to cut costs further. You could not slice it and eat it like meat. It was rubbery and bland until it was rendered in a pan, and then it became cooking grease. Enslaved cooks used it to fry everything because it was the only fat available. A square of fatback dropped into a pot of boiling greens gave them flavor and calories. Fatback had no protein to speak of. What it had was energy, dense and heavy, the kind that kept a body moving through 12 hours of cotton picking, but left the muscles weak and the teeth loose from malnutrition. Plantation account books listed fatback purchases alongside entries for axle grease and fence nails. It was a supply, not a food. Number 21. Offal and hog intestines. When a hog was slaughtered on the plantation each winter, the owner kept the hams, loins, shoulders, and ribs. The enslaved received what was left, the intestines, stomachs, ears, feet, snouts, and tails, parts that white families would not touch. The intestines required hours of cleaning, turned inside out, scraped, soaked in salt water, and rinsed again and again until the smell became tolerable. Then they were boiled or fried into what became known as chitterlings, or chitlins. The labor to prepare them was enormous, but the result was food. Real food with protein and fat that the cornmeal and salt pork ration could not provide. Enslaved women turned this act of disposal into an act of survival. They seasoned the offal with what they could find: wild onion, pepper, vinegar. Over generations, chitterlings became a tradition, carried forward into freedom and eventually onto holiday tables across Black America. The food that was meant to degrade became a symbol of resilience. That transformation is one of the most powerful stories in American culinary history. Number 20. Pot liquor. After greens were boiled down with a piece of fatback or salt pork, the murky liquid left in the pot was called pot liquor. It was dark, salty, rich with whatever vitamins had leached out of the collards or turnip greens during cooking. Enslaved people drank it straight from the pot or soaked cornbread in it because they understood instinctively what nutritional science would confirm a century later. That liquid contained iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C. In a diet built on empty calories, pot liquor was medicine. Children were given it first. Mothers made sure every drop was consumed. On some plantations, the pot liquor was the most nutritious thing anyone consumed all week. Physicians in the antebellum South noted that enslaved people who ate greens and drank the cooking liquid showed fewer signs of scurvy and pellagra than those fed cornmeal alone. Yet no one adjusted the rations. The observation was noted and filed away. Pot liquor survived because the people who needed it most refused to let it go. Number 19. Cowpeas and field peas. Black-eyed peas were not always a New Year's tradition. On plantations across the Deep South, cowpeas were animal feed. Planters grew them to restore nitrogen to cotton-depleted soil and to fatten livestock. The peas that were too damaged or too old for the animals were given to enslaved workers as a supplement to the cornmeal ration. Women boiled them for hours with whatever pork scraps were available, mashing the soft peas into a paste that could be spread on corn pone or eaten with a spoon. The combination of corn and legume created a complete protein, something neither food could provide alone. This was not accidental. West African food traditions, carried across the Atlantic in the memories of enslaved people, included the pairing of grain and bean as a dietary foundation. Planters never understood why their enslaved workers clung to these peas. They saw it as proof of low standards. In truth, it was inherited nutritional wisdom keeping people alive against impossible odds. Number 18. Raccoon. When the weekly ration ran out, and it almost always did, enslaved people hunted at night. Raccoon was one of the most common catches. Trapped in the woods after a full day of field labor, the meat was dark, greasy, and gamey, with a strong, musky flavor that had to be masked with long cooking and heavy seasoning. Some methods involved parboiling the raccoon first to remove excess fat, then roasting it with sweet potatoes. The texture was tough and stringy if rushed, but cooked low and slow over coals, the meat softened into something edible. Hunting raccoon carried risk. Leaving the quarters at night could result in severe punishment, including whipping. Dogs patrolled some properties, specifically to prevent movement after dark. Yet the hunger was worse than the threat. Former enslaved people recalled raccoon suppers as small victories, shared in the dark among trusted neighbors. The animal no one else wanted became a lifeline. That pattern repeated itself across every entry on this list. What was discarded became essential. First pattern, break. Here is where the story shifts. Everything we have counted so far was given or scavenged within the brutal logic of the plantation. But enslaved people did not simply accept what they were handed. They cultivated. On tiny garden plots, sometimes no larger than a quarter acre, they grew what the ration system refused to provide. Okra, brought to the Americas from West Africa in the holds of slave ships, became one of the most important crops. Planted between rows of corn or along fence lines, okra thrived in the southern heat and produced pods that could be fried, stewed, or dried for winter. But here is the part that matters most. Okra was not just food, it was connection. Every pod carried the memory of a homeland most would never see again. Women stolen from Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Gold Coast recognized the plant and taught their children how to grow it. Slave owners saw a weed. Enslaved families saw survival and identity growing in the same soil. Okra's mucilaginous texture thickened stews that would otherwise be nothing but water and scraps. When gumbo eventually became a signature dish of the American South, it was built on this foundation, on the knowledge and labor of people who were given nothing and created a cuisine. Number 16. Possum. Opossum was the other nighttime catch, slower than raccoon, easier to trap, and available in enormous numbers across the rural South. The meat was pale and fatty, with a sweetish taste that some compared to pork. Enslaved people roasted possum whole, often tucking sweet potatoes around the carcass, letting the fat render down and baste the roots. Done right, roasted until the skin crisped and the fat melted into the potatoes, it was one of the richest meals an enslaved family might eat all month. Possum suppers became communal events in some quarters, shared among families after successful hunts. The sharing was strategic. Building community around food meant building trust, and trust was essential for everything from passing information to planning escape. Number 15. Molasses. Cane molasses was the byproduct of sugar production, the thick, dark syrup left behind after crystallization. On sugar plantations in Louisiana, it was the cheapest output of the most brutal labor in American slavery. The molasses given to enslaved workers was the lowest grade, black strap, intensely bitter, and nearly unpalatable on its own. Mixed into cornmeal mush or spread on corn pone, it provided iron and quick energy. Children craved the sweetness despite the harsh metallic aftertaste. A quart per week was a common ration. Some owners used molasses as a reward or withheld it as punishment, turning a basic calorie source into a tool of behavioral control. The irony was savage. People forced to grow, harvest, and process sugarcane were given only the dregs of their own labor. Number 14. Hominy. Lye-treated corn prepared through nixtamalization. Dried corn kernels were soaked in lye water until the hulls sloughed off and the kernels swelled to twice their size. The process, called nixtamalization, was borrowed from indigenous food traditions and transformed nutritionally empty corn into something the body could actually use. The lye treatment released niacin, a vitamin locked inside untreated corn. Without it, a corn-heavy diet led to pellagra, a disease that caused skin lesions, diarrhea, and eventually death. Enslaved people who made hominy were unknowingly preventing a nutritional disaster that would later ravage poor white communities in the early 20th century, when the knowledge was lost. Hominy was chewy, bland, and filling. Fried in fatback, it became something close to satisfying. Ground coarsely, it became grits, a dish that would outlast the institution that created the conditions for its necessity. Number 13. Sweet potatoes. The sweet potato was the most important crop in the enslaved garden. Hardy, prolific, and nearly impossible to kill, it grew in poor soil, survived drought, and produced tubers that could feed a family for weeks. Enslaved people roasted sweet potatoes in the embers of dying fires, baked them in ash pits, or boiled them into a thick mash. The natural sugar content made them one of the few genuinely pleasant foods available. Children ate them like candy. On some plantations, owners distributed sweet potatoes as part of the ration, recognizing their cheapness. On others, enslaved workers grew their own and occasionally sold the surplus at local markets, one of the few ways to earn small amounts of money. The sweet potato was also a food of memory. Varieties brought from the Caribbean and West Africa connected enslaved communities to agricultural traditions that predated their captivity. Number 12. Rabbit and squirrel. Small game was the protein source most accessible to enslaved people who hunted on their own time. Rabbits were snared with simple traps made from twine and bent saplings. Squirrels were knocked from trees with thrown stones. Both animals were abundant, and their absence from the woods drew less suspicion than a missing chicken. The meat was lean, mild, and tender when stewed long enough. Women stretched a single rabbit into a meal for an entire family by adding root vegetables and thickening the broth with cornmeal. Hunting and trapping required knowledge passed between generations, skills carried from Africa and adapted to the American landscape. Every snare set in the dark was an act of defiance against a system designed to control every hour of every day. Collards grew year-round in the southern climate, surviving frosts that killed other crops. Enslaved people planted them in garden plots and gathered wild greens from the edges of fields and forests. The tough, bitter leaves required long cooking to become tender, simmered in water with a piece of salt pork or fatback until they collapsed into a dark, silky mass. The bitterness mellowed with time, and the cooking liquid became the pot liquor that sustained entire families. Collards provided fiber, vitamins, and minerals that the corn and pork ration lacked entirely. Their importance cannot be overstated. On plantations where garden plots were forbidden, enslaved workers risked punishment to gather wild greens because the alternative was the slow deterioration of scurvy and pellagra. Collard greens survived emancipation and became a cornerstone of Southern black cooking, appearing at every holiday table and Sunday dinner as an unbroken link to a past that refused to be erased. Second pattern. Break. Let us pause here because something needs to be said plainly. Every food on this list exists at the intersection of cruelty and genius. The cruelty was the system that rationed human beings like livestock, that calculated calories against labor output, that gave people the worst and kept the best. The genius belonged to the people who took those scraps and built a cuisine. The seasonings, the techniques, the patience to cook tough cuts into tenderness, all of that knowledge was carried in the hands and memories of enslaved women and men who received no credit for feeding America. What we call Southern food today, the barbecue, the greens, the cornbread, the stewed beans, every bit of it was born in this suffering and shaped by this brilliance. That is the truth that sits underneath every entry on this list. On larger plantations, enslaved people sometimes received hardtack, a dry, nearly indestructible cracker made from flour and water. It was baked until every drop of moisture was gone, leaving a brick that had to be soaked in water or pot liquor before teeth could break it apart. Worms and weevils infested stored hardtack regularly. Former enslaved people described tapping the crackers against a table to shake the insects loose before eating. Stale bread from the main house was also passed down to the quarters, sometimes days old and spotted with mold. Women cut away the spoiled sections and soaked the rest into a bread pudding sweetened with molasses. Waste was not a concept that existed when every calorie mattered. Number 9. Crayfish and catfish. Waterways on and around plantations provided protein that no overseer controlled. Enslaved men and boys fished at night, setting hand-woven traps in creeks and rivers for catfish and crayfish. Catfish, a bottom feeder disdained by wealthy whites, was the perfect catch. It was abundant, easy to clean, and its firm white flesh held up to frying in rendered pork fat. Crayfish were boiled in large pots with whatever seasoning could be found, a practice with direct roots in West African cooking traditions. These nighttime fishing trips served double purposes. They provided food, and they created rare moments of autonomy, hours spent away from surveillance doing something that felt human. Number 8. Poke salad and wild greens. When garden plots were small or non-existent, wild greens filled the gap. Pokeweed, dandelion, lamb's quarters, and purslane grew along fence rows and ditches. Pokeweed was the most common and the most dangerous. The mature plant is toxic, capable of causing vomiting, seizures, and death. But young poke shoots, harvested in early spring and boiled in at least 2 changes of water, became a tender green safe to eat. The knowledge of which plants to gather, when to harvest, and how to prepare them safely was critical survival information. A mistake could kill. Enslaved women held this botanical expertise and passed it through generations. Poke salad became a spring tradition across the South, a food born of desperation that eventually earned its own folk songs, though the people who first relied on it were rarely mentioned. Number 7. Pig feet. The feet of the hog, like the intestines and ears, were discarded by plantation families and given to the enslaved. They arrived grimy, covered in coarse hair, and required singeing, scraping, and boiling before they were edible. Hours of slow cooking turned the tough skin and connective tissue into something soft and gelatinous, the collagen breaking down into a rich, sticky broth. Pickled pig feet, simmered in vinegar and spices, became a preserved food that lasted weeks without refrigeration. The method was both African and practical. Enslaved cooks transformed an animal part that was literally thrown at them into a delicacy that persisted through generations. Pig feet showed up at juke joints, fish fries, and family reunions for 100 years after emancipation. What the plantation meant as an insult, black cooks turned into an institution. Number 6. Cornmeal mush. When corn pone required too much effort or there was no fire for baking, cornmeal was simply boiled in water until it thickened into a porridge. That was mush. No salt, no fat, no flavor, just starch and water. On some plantations, mush was the standard breakfast for enslaved children, ladled into shared bowls or poured onto flat boards. Accounts by Frederick Douglass and others describe children eating from communal containers on the ground, scooping with hands or oyster shells. The mush was deliberately basic. It kept children alive at the lowest possible cost while their parents labored. Nutritionally, plain cornmeal mush was a slow disaster, providing calories but almost nothing else. Children raised on it suffered from stunted growth, weakened bones, and chronic fatigue. Plantation records noted these conditions but attributed them to racial inferiority rather than starvation. The mush was evidence, and the people who imposed it refused to read it. Number 5. Hog head cheese. After the hog killing, the head was boiled until every scrap of meat fell from the skull. The cheeks, tongue, and bits of flesh were chopped fine, seasoned with vinegar, pepper, and salt, then pressed into a mold and chilled until the natural gelatin set everything into a firm loaf. Hog head cheese was preservation as much as recipe. It lasted weeks in cool weather, providing protein long after the slaughter. Enslaved women who mastered the technique were valued for stretching one hog's head into food for days. The flavor was rich and porky, the texture dense with small pieces of meat suspended in savory jelly. Like chitterlings and pig feet, hog head cheese followed black communities out of slavery and into the 20th century, appearing in butcher shops and corner stores across the South. Number 4. Clabber and buttermilk. Fresh milk rarely reached the slave quarters. What did arrive was clabber, raw milk left to sour and thicken into a yogurt-like mass, and buttermilk, the thin acidic liquid left after churning butter for the main house. Both were considered waste products. Clabber was tangy and thick, eaten with a spoon or mixed into cornbread batter to provide lift and moisture. Buttermilk served the same purpose, and it was often drunk straight, despite its sour taste. These fermented dairy products provided calcium and protein that the standard ration lacked entirely. The bacterial cultures in clabber also aided digestion. Plantation mistresses poured these liquids out or fed them to pigs until someone realized the enslaved workers wanted them. After that, the leftovers were distributed deliberately, one more way to reduce costs while appearing generous. Number 3. Stolen scraps from the big house. This entry is different because it was not rationed or grown. It was taken. Enslaved cooks who worked in plantation kitchens smuggled food back to the quarters, hiding biscuits in apron pockets, wrapping meat in cloth, pouring gravy into jars tucked beneath skirts. The risk was severe. Theft of food was punishable by whipping, sale, or worse. Yet it happened on virtually every plantation because the hunger in the quarters was constant, and the abundance in the main house was obscene. Some formerly enslaved people described elaborate systems of concealment, coded signals between kitchen workers and field hands, and children stationed as lookouts. The stolen scraps, a piece of ham, a handful of flour, a cup of sugar, transformed meals from mere survival into something that tasted like defiance. Every biscuit smuggled out was a small revolution. Slaveholders called it theft. History calls it something else entirely. Number 2. Hoe cake. The hoe cake gets its own entry separate from corn pone because of what it represents. The name comes from its origin. Cornmeal batter cooked on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over a fire in the field. There was no kitchen, no table, no plate, just a tool meant for chopping earth, repurposed to cook food during a brief midday pause in labor. Enslaved field workers carried their cornmeal ration with them, mixed it with creek water, and cooked it on whatever metal surface was available. The hoe cake was the ultimate expression of the plantation's disregard for enslaved people's humanity. You were not worth a pan. You were not worth a break long enough to sit down. You cooked on your work tool, in your work field, on your work time. And yet, the hoe cake became an American classic. George Washington reportedly loved them. Thomas Jefferson served them at Monticello, prepared by the enslaved people whose ingenuity he never acknowledged. The hoe cake carries that full weight of history in every bite. Number 1. Whatever could be found. The most brutal food on this list is not a single dish. It is the condition itself. The constant grinding hunger that forced 4 million enslaved people to eat anything that could keep a body standing. Bark boiled into tea during the worst shortages. Clay eaten from riverbanks, a practice called geophagy, driven by mineral deficiencies so severe that the body craved dirt. Roasted acorns ground into bitter flour, turtle eggs dug from creek banks, persimmons so astringent they puckered the mouth until the first frost softened them. Every one of these foods tells the same story. A people who were given the absolute minimum to survive and responded not with surrender, but with an astonishing will to live. They studied every plant, every animal, every waterway. They remembered the foodways of their ancestors and adapted them to a hostile landscape. And from that suffering, they built the foundation of what the entire world now recognizes as American Southern cuisine. The barbecue, the fried chicken, the greens and cornbread, the gumbo and jambalaya. All of it traces back to people who were told they were worth less than the food they were denied. That is the list. 25 foods that tell a story most of America was never taught. If one entry stayed with you, drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because this history is not finished being told.